Here are 27 things we learned from planning and going on an Alaskan cruise.
Hey everyone, it's Andy and Jenna here from A Couple Travelers. We just got back from a 7-night Alaskan cruise aboard Royal Caribbean's Ovation of the Seas. Even if you've cruised before, a cruise to Alaska is very different, so this video is going to cover everything that we wish we knew before going on an Alaskan cruise.
Now, most of these tips will be helpful if you're going on any cruise to Alaska, but some of them will be specific to Royal Caribbean and even more specific to our ship Ovation of the Seas. But let's get into it.
Tip number 1, book early. Alaska and an Alaskan cruise is not a trip you want to plan last minute by any means. It's very popular and the season is very short because of the weather and the overall climate of Alaska. So the cruise season there is typically from May to October, with June, July, and August having the best weather. So you'll find that as you go through the planning process that things will start to book up rather early. For example, one of the excursions we were looking at, we started to look at about 10 months before our cruise and it was already sold out. So just keep that in mind as you go through your cruise planning process for an Alaskan cruise.
Tip number 2, book with a travel agent. Hey, you may not know this, but it is completely free to work with a travel agent. You'll pay the same price as if you go to Royal Caribbean's website and book yourself, but you could work with somebody like me who just went on one and can help you find the right ship and the right itinerary for your family, recommend excursions, put together all your travel documents. So if you're interested in more information or even starting to look at pricing out some options for you, I'll put my email in the video description below.
Tip number 3 for cruising to Alaska is expect to pay more. Because the cruise season is so short, things are just naturally more expensive from the itineraries themselves and more specifically to the excursions that you take in port. A lot of those excursions are operated by people who have seasonal businesses running those excursions, so they obviously need to make a year's livelihood within a span of 6 to 8 months. We had some great excursions. We were happy to pay the price for a once or twice in a lifetime trip for us, but overall expect to pay more. If you want to know more specifically about what an Alaskan cruise costs based on our experience, we have a video already out on the channel that's linked below that goes into all the details of what we paid for our 7-night Alaska Glacier Cruise.
Tip number 4, pay attention to the timing of your excursions. So after you book your cruise, you're gonna wanna immediately start looking at excursions and book any that you are interested in. And our first piece of advice is to really pay attention to how long you're in port and how long or how much time the excursion that you're looking at is gonna take up of that port time. So for example, if it says you're in Juneau until 7 p.m., that really means that all aboard is at 6:30. So if you see, oh, we're in Juneau till 7 and our excursion goes to 6, that means we have a full hour to explore port and go get some souvenirs and all the, cool gift shops that are there. Well, you're really only gonna have a half hour, and that's if the excursion is actually on time. So if it's important to you to be able to walk around port, to make sure that you have time for souvenirs, you may want to really just pay attention to the timing of the excursion and maybe book a shorter one or one that ends much earlier if you want that time, especially since of the 4 ports, for 3 of them, Ketchikan was the only exception. We met our excursion group on the ship and disembarked together, so there wasn't even a getting off early to try to go look for souvenirs in port, so just pay attention to excursion timing for your cruise.
So for most of the excursions we did on this cruise, they had multiple components to them. So what that meant was our time afterwards was limited to explore the port. And going to places like Skagway and Ketchikan and Juneau, places that are in the United States but do not feel like they're in the United States, you want to take advantage of that time to explore, get some of the local food, support the local businesses, and just be part of the culture. You could of course get that on an excursion, but I think one thing that we would probably adjust going forward is maybe doing an excursion that has 1 or 2 components instead of an excursion that has 2 to 3 components to save some of that time for the port itself.
And going along with that, just knowing our excursions took up most of the port time, we actually would recommend not booking any dinner reservations or any show reservations around the time that your port time is ending. So like if you're in Juneau till 8, don't book a 7:30 dinner or an 8 o'clock show on the ship, you want to really take advantage of the time in port. You know, of our 7-day cruise, we were only in 3 Alaskan ports for a certain amount of hours. So I would just say really take advantage of the port time and book things after the end of your port day for dinner and for shows. You don't want to rush back on the ship for a show that you can see the rest of the time on the cruise.
Tip number 5, bring a passport or get a passport if you don't already have one. For specific ports of call, you may not be required to have one, but for example, our excursion in Skagway went into Canada for a brief period of time, and so in order to participate in that excursion, we had to show our passport to Canadian Customs and then US Customs entering back into the United States. Again, get a passport if you don't already have one, or just bring your passport on the cruise.
Tip number 6 is to select the earliest arrival time that you can for your embarkation day. If you don't know, you can check in on the Royal Caribbean app 45 days before you're sailing. And on the app, well in advance, it'll actually tell you what your check-in date is. So I highly recommend once you are booked, go into the app, find that date, and put it on your calendar. And when that date rolls around, you're gonna wanna get up early or stay up late the night before and after midnight, go online, check in, and just select the earliest time available. You'll beat the rush of crowds to get on the ship, and then most importantly is that once you're on the ship, you can start making reservations for dining and for things like the North Star, which sell out extremely fast. So the earlier you get out on board, the earlier you can make reservations and get, of course, your vacation going.
Tip number 7, arrive to your port of departure at least 1 day early. Whether you like it or not, that ship is leaving whether you're there or not. You obviously want to get on board. If you are traveling quite a ways, if there's a flight involved, you want to leave ample time for any sort of hiccups that might arise. We always make it a habit to get into port at least the morning before the cruise to give us roughly a full 24 hours in port to kind of settle in and just be there for when the cruise leaves. Another reason for getting into port early for an Alaskan cruise for us specifically was the overall time change. We're on the East Coast and all Alaska cruises depart from the West Coast, typically Seattle or Vancouver, so that's 3 hours behind, and then when you actually cruise up to Alaska, you were going another hour behind. So we wanted to give our bodies a day, day and a half to start to adjust to the time change to really make the most of our vacation. And also there's just a lot to do in Seattle. It's a great city, and we have a vlog up on the channel now that's linked below that covers everything we did the day before our cruise.
Tip number 8, pack for all weather. The weather in Alaska can be very diverse. It can really be anywhere from like 40 to 60 degrees, and it rains 300 days out of the year.
On average.
On average. Our recommendation is to pack in layers, make sure you have waterproof items, at the very least a waterproof coat and waterproof shoes, and then some things that you may not think about. Binoculars, we use those a lot. Bathing suit and flip-flops. You wouldn't think to bring those on an Alaskan cruise, you need that. But we have a video out on our YouTube channel that goes through our actual packing list that we used for the trip, category by category, what we brought. I think that would be really helpful for you to watch while you're planning to go on your trip, and we will link that video below.
And included in that video is the actual packing list that we use, so if you want to duplicate that and use it for your vacation, it's right in that video. Tip number 9, you could probably leave the formal wear at home. From our experience on this Alaskan cruise, we didn't find too many people participating in the formal night or the dress for success night. I think this is very specific to our experience. If you were to go on a cruise like Holland America or Cunard that typically attracts an older crowd, they are more prone to participating in the formal nights, but just based on our experience, we only saw a small percentage of the guests actually dressing up and taking advantage of that evening. We also found ourselves not changing into a nicer outfit for dinner on most nights because we were coming back from port and didn't have a lot of time to run back to the cabin and change before a show or a dinner reservation. So we were perfectly fine staying in our more casual clothes, maybe just freshening up in the cabin quickly, but overall just kind of staying in that attire for the evening.
Tip number 10, buy a blanket ahead of time. You can actually go to the Royal Caribbean website before your cruise, and there is a special gift section, and you can order things like champagne and chocolate covered strawberries to the room. You can order birthday or anniversary decorations. And for our cruise, they had a special Alaska themed blanket available. And it was only $30, and we purchased it a couple of months in advance, and it was there waiting in our room when we arrived. And this blanket was just perfect for, cold Alaska mornings, for hanging out on our balcony. Our room attendant used it when she made up the bed every day, and it's a wonderful souvenir. Our only recommendation is to make sure you leave room in your suitcase when you're packing for your cruise to be able to bring it home with you. And actually, at the time of recording this video, which is mid-July of 2023, we are actually hearing of some supply chain issues for this, where people had ordered them and they just don't have the inventory right now. So fingers crossed it is available for your sailing, because it's one of my favorite souvenirs. If this video has been helpful so far, please give us a thumbs up, leave a comment. It really helps us with the YouTube algorithm.
And we have a lot more videos coming to the channel from our Alaskan cruise, including excursion reviews. So be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss those videos when they come out. Tip number 11 is plan to arrive at your port of departure at least 30 minutes before your embarkation time. And this is for a variety of reasons. The first is that we found when we got to the actual port, there was just a lot of traffic of people getting out of their cars or their Uber or their Lyft to get into the actual cruise terminal and to drop their luggage off. The other reason is that specifically for the pier in Seattle, where Ovation of the Seas departs from, we found that the rideshare drop-off point was actually a decent ways away from the cruise terminal itself. So if you are taking a rideshare, an Uber or a Lyft, ask your driver to bring you to the actual luggage drop-off point. That'll be right adjacent to the ship. So that way you don't have to lug the luggage through the parking lot to then check in at the cruise terminal.
Now, there actually is a complimentary shuttle that takes guests from the Uber Lyft official drop-off to the terminal. We didn't do that since we asked our Lyft driver to take us to the luggage drop-off, as Andy mentioned. I would assume that it just takes a lot of time for the shuttle to keep going back and forth, since it is basically just a traffic jam. But on our disembarkation, we did use the complimentary shuttle to get us from the terminal to the official Lyft pickup spot. And that was super fast because there wasn't traffic since we got off the ship very early. But that's something good if your Uber driver doesn't want to take you all the way down to the luggage and you get dropped off there. Maybe keep an eye out for the shuttle so that you don't have to physically walk with all your luggage. Tip number 12, do everything that you can at home. This will save you time on embarkation day to have all of your ducks in a row. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, you need to do the online check-in 45 days out before you're sailing. But then about a week before our sailing, we kept getting some push notifications inviting us to fill out other forms that we needed. Specifically, 2 days before the sailing, we got a notification to complete a health questionnaire, which we completed immediately. And then the morning of our sailing, we got a notification that we could actually watch our muster drill videos before heading to the ship. So we did that in the hotel the morning of our sailing. And then when we actually arrived to the terminal and we went through security and all of that, all we had to do is show our set sail pass basically, and then just walk right on the ship. So having everything done in advance will save you a lot of time, and you don't want to be stuck in the terminal filling something out and delay the vacation.
Tip number 13 is bring lots of cash. We brought $300 with us and we pretty much used all of it. It was the perfect amount for our 7-night cruise, and we use it for a variety of reasons. One, you are going to want to tip the people who are handling your luggage at the cruise port. Second, we had excursion drivers and excursion guides who we wanted to tip. And the thing with this was some of the excursions had multiple drivers and multiple guides, so you want to make sure to cover all of them who are bringing you on your excursion. And then you also want to tip your stateroom attendant, to the person, making up your cabin over the course of the cruise. And we would recommend bringing a lot of 5s and 10s as your denominations, maybe some 20s in there as well. We found a lot of the tasks where that would have been a very sufficient amount to tip the guide or the driver or whoever you were tipping.
Tip number 14 is to have everything important on you when you embark on the ship. So basically, anything you leave with the luggage attendants at the cruise terminal may not make its way to your room until 8 p.m. on the first night. So you need to make sure that you have anything that you would need in that time up till 8 p.m. on your actual person when you go on the cruise ship. So especially making sure you have your passport, your boarding pass for the ship, any medications you need, a bathing suit if you plan to go to the pool right away, and maybe even your dinner outfit for night one. We ended up getting our luggage by 4:30 on the first day, but it could be as late as 8 p.m. So make sure you have everything that you need on day one with you.
Tip number 15 is once you are on board the ship, do your essentials. So things like heading to your muster station to check that box, things like heading to a dining room to book your dining reservations. You'll also want to book the complimentary North Star as soon as you get on the cruise. Now this was very specific to us. All Quantum class ships in the Royal Caribbean fleet have this North Star observation pod as something you can reserve, but if you are not going on that class of ship, you won't have this. We plan to always do the paid version, but the complimentary version was actually booked up by 1 p.m. when we got on board, so plan to do that as early as possible. Lastly, book any shows you'll want to see aboard the ship and any just general activities that you want to take part in. So trivias, the Love and Marriage game show, anything like that, just make sure you add it to your cruise calendar.
Tip number 16 is to be prepared for seasickness. Now, once you are actually in Alaska, you're sailing the inside passage between ports, it will be incredibly smooth. But once you kind of leave Seattle and you have your sea day heading to Alaska and on the reverse coming back from Canada, you are out in the open ocean and it can definitely get a bit rocky. There were several, for the entire day on both our sea days, you really could feel the ship kind of going back and forth. Bring Dramamine or sea bands or those little patches that they have that you can put behind your ears, anything that will help you feel better in that kind of rockiness that a lot of people feel on an Alaskan cruise. Thankfully, we never actually got seasick. I did take something on the first sea day when I started to feel the ship a little bit, but we were thankfully both pretty good. If you are really bad with seasickness, you may want to consider doing an itinerary out of Vancouver that maybe isn't as much in the open ocean and is more just about heading right to Alaska and doing the ports, maybe a better option for you.
And we actually learned from the captain on the Captain's Corner activity of the ship that cruises in the Pacific Ocean tend to be a little bit rockier just by the nature of the Pacific Ocean itself. He says there's typically a lot more swell that will contribute to the ship, so not so much high waves, but the actual swell of the ocean that you'll feel as opposed to sailing in the Atlantic or the Caribbean. Tip number 17 is that the Wi-Fi will most likely disappoint you as it did with us on our cruise. This is typical for most cruises if the ship hasn't upgraded to something like Starlink that Royal Caribbean is in the process of doing right now, but you're gonna especially find this on an Alaskan cruise when you are sailing in between mountains and service from satellites is gonna be a little spotty, so the ship won't be able to get Wi-Fi. In addition to that, you're always gonna wanna have your phone on airplane mode as well, so you avoid any international roaming fees. For an Alaskan cruise in particular though, once you get into port, you are in the United States, and depending on your cell provider, you could probably pick up cell service in the ports. In Juneau, Skagway, and Ketchikan, we were able to have pretty decent cell service and were able to text and be on the internet without having to be on Wi-Fi.
And one thing to note, since your phone will or should be in airplane mode, especially after the Alaskan ports when you are then gonna be at sea and then heading to Canada, when the clocks actually switch from being 4 hours behind East Coast, an hour behind West Coast time, when you're in Alaska and you're heading to Canada, the ship time changes. So you are now on Pacific time. Your phone will not update because it is on airplane mode. So you have to be careful. It's very easy those last few days to just look at your phone and think you know the time. The Royal Caribbean app will have the official ship time, so just something to keep in mind.
And they communicate activities and other information in ship time, so again, be sure to always check the app for what that ship time is. And another thing to note, semi-related to Wi-Fi, is that the TV in the cabin didn't have a wide variety of channels to watch. So it was your typical onboard Royal Caribbean channels, but then the actual channels themselves were mostly international and pretty random. So recommend bringing a iPad or a laptop to watch movies or any shows that you might have saved to a device. But again, make sure you download them before getting on the ship because the Wi-Fi could be spotty.
Tip number 18 is to be prepared for last minute changes. As we mentioned before, the weather in Alaska is very diverse. It changes quickly, even in the matter of an hour or so. So don't be surprised if an excursion gets canceled because the weather is bad. If your ship can't get close to a glacier the morning that you're sailing the inside passage because icebergs are too big and it can't get through. Or even be surprised if a port that you're going to changes. Something as simple as Skagway had landslides recently, and a lot of sailings that are stopping at Skagway have changed and are now perhaps going to Sitka or somewhere else. So just keep in mind that things can change very quickly. The captain will always make a judgment call about what is safe, so just be flexible and keep in mind that everyone's doing the best they can, and hopefully you will actually be able to do what you planned.
And for Royal Caribbean specifically right now in Skagway, those itinerary changes were specific to cruises on Quantum of the Seas. Thankfully, Ovation of the Seas itineraries were unaffected, but Quantum of the Seas did have to make some adjustments because the pier that the Quantum class ships dock at was the one most affected by the landslides. Tip number 19 is buy souvenirs as early in your trip as possible. We talked before about how a lot of the excursions ran a little later and we didn't have a lot of time in port, so we were very thankful to actually get souvenirs and dedicate the time to shopping in ports like Ketchikan, which is our first port of call, to then actually bring the souvenirs with us back on the ship.
Yeah, he made a joke that we were at our first port, the first store I walk into, I buy a couple of things. And so I'm so glad that we did because we didn't end up having as much time in the other ports. So I was glad that I got a couple of things in Ketchikan, which ended up being my favorite port of the trip.
My favorite port too.
Tip number 20 is to keep a list of the crew members who made your trip. We love doing this, and we do this on every type of vacation that we go on. Whenever we leave for a trip, we start a note in our phone, and every time we have a great interaction with a crew member, somebody who was like a really great server, or if your state attendant's great, we keep track of everyone's names and the date, where it was, maybe keep track of, if they said something nice or what they did. And we use that at the end of the trip where you might get a survey from the cruise line about your experience. They often use that for things like bonuses or promotions even. They love hearing if a crew member really made your trip. So it's just a fun thing that we really love doing.
So specifically from our sailing, we had a number of great interactions with the crew aboard Ovation of the Seas. So specifically want to shout out Vinay, Edwin, Billy, Lorna, Bonds, John, and Yaron. Thank you guys for making our vacation so great. Tip number 21 is don't try to bring food or drink off the ship. This is something that we were kind of surprised by for Alaska. It's part of their agricultural laws in the state that you're only allowed to bring one unopened bottle of water off the ship. So Jenna, for example, had to quickly drink her iced coffee that she was planning to bring into port with her. So just one thing to keep in mind is that just plan to bring an unopened bottle of water, and anything else should stay in your cabin.
Now the next few tips are going to be port and excursion specific. So we're going to be talking about Ketchikan, Juneau, Skagway, Victoria, British Columbia, and then even our morning, the Dawes Glacier and Endicott Arm morning that we had as well in the inside passage. Tip number 22 is to eat in port. Some of the best meals and snacks and even beers that we had were things that we ate either on excursions or in the actual ports themselves. In general, I'm not the biggest fan of eating in ports on Caribbean cruises. It's a lot of like your senior frogs and Margaritavilles and whatnot, and it's usually like super touristy. But the Alaskan ports are absolutely incredible, and they are known for their bars and their restaurants especially. I know, you paid a lot to be on the ship and have certain meals included, but I think it's worth paying the extra bit to eat in the actual ports. And especially want to highlight the Alaska Fish House in Ketchikan, where I had the fish and chips sampler. That was delicious. We loved the beers we had at the Skagway Brewing Company, and hats off to the poutine that we had in Canada at the Swans Brewery.
Tip number 23 is all about the port of Ketchikan. This was by far our favorite port of the cruise because it just has a lot of great things going for it. Not that the other ports didn't, but we just found a specific affinity towards Ketchikan. Now, firstly for Ketchikan is plan to get off the ship early. Like Jenna mentioned earlier, our experience with our excursions was that we met our excursion group off the ship on the actual pier itself. That may not be specific to your cruise depending on what ship or what cruise line you go on, but this was just based on our experience. So we had a lot of time before our excursion actually left to go check out some of the gift shops that are directly adjacent to the cruise port and just start to take in some of the city. Secondly, this is where the Great Alaskan Lumberjack Show is, and partly why I'm wearing this shirt, because this is what the lumberjacks wear. But this was a fantastic show, would highly recommend it, even if you have another excursion going on in Ketchikan. They have multiple showings throughout the day. I believe it was 4 or 5 of them over the course of the day. So plan to tack that on to your trip if you were able to do so.
It's just a less than 5-minute walk from the ship, so it's very convenient.
Earlier, Jenna mentioned the Alaska Fish House. That is right next door to the Great Alaskan Lumberjack Show. So when we were waiting in line there, we waited just about 30 minutes. If you have some time in port before or after your excursion, good spot to grab some food. Also in Ketchikan, you have Creek Street. That is a pretty quick walk from the cruise port as well. And this is a very famous street in Ketchikan. A lot of the buildings are built above the river, so it's very picturesque. A lot of great local businesses along that street, so we took a few minutes out of the day to go there, explore the shops, and take some photos. For reference, in this port, our excursion was the Ketchikan Highlights and Lumberjack Show. We spent $141.98 on this excursion for the two of us, and we'll have a video of all our excursions on the channel soon. Please subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss any of those videos.
Tip number 24 is all about the port of Skagway. And as we mentioned earlier, this port just had some landslides in the area. So right now, for Royal Caribbean and other ships that dock there, it is actually unsafe to walk off the ship and walk towards town. So there is currently complimentary shuttles being offered, which takes time to get off the ship. So on Royal Caribbean specifically, they're having guests who aren't getting off with an excursion, which is what we did. We gathered as our excursion group in one of the main dining rooms, and we disembarked together and got on our tour bus. But for everybody else who's wishing to get off the ship, you actually had to get a ticket, and they called you in groups. We heard from some guests who had to do this that it took a lot longer than they thought to actually get off the ship. We heard some people missed their separate excursions that they booked through a separate company and not directly through Royal. So if you are somebody who does that and tends to book excursions independently, you may want to rethink that currently in Skagway just due to everything that's going on.
And just as a more general note that's related to Skagway, if you book your excursions through the cruise line itself, that will kind of give you a little bit of comfort knowing that you have priority in things such as the shuttles. And also, for any excursions that are booked officially through the cruise line, the ship will not leave until all of those excursions are back and everybody's back on the ship. So if you were just off on your own or book an excursion through a third party and you were not back by the gangway up time, then there is a chance the ship might leave without you.
Right, and our excursion out of Victoria, BC, we actually arrived a little bit late. And we just didn't have to worry at all because they weren't going to leave without us. Now on the way back, we actually did need to take the complimentary shuttle because once our excursion was ended, we did spend a little time in port. We went to the Skagway Brewing Company for some beers and a pretzel. Little snack time while we were walking around for a little bit. It was unfortunate that at that time in the day, it was pretty late in the day, a lot of the stores were already closed and it was pretty much a ghost town at that point, so we really didn't get to truly feel like the magic that I assume Skagway is when everything is open and people are walking around. But on the way back, we did have to wait in a very long line to get back on the complimentary shuttle to make our way to the ship. I think we waited in line for a good 30 or so minutes to get on a shuttle.
They were moving it along well, though. They had officers from the ship out there making sure people had their questions answered and were just being directed in the right location. So it was a relatively smooth process. We just had to wait in that line.
Besides the Skagway Brewing Company, which we definitely recommend that you check out, the Red Onion Saloon, which used to be one of the best brothels during the gold rush, is right in the middle of town. This was actually part of the excursion that we did in Skagway, which was the Best of Skagway tour. It was $627.98 for the two of us, but it stopped at the Red Onion Saloon. It went to Liarsville, where we had a salmon bake and learned about journalism during the gold rush. And then lastly, we did the Yukon Route Railway, which was a train ride that we took from Canada back into the town of Skagway, which was absolutely stunning. The views were beautiful. We will have a full video on this and all of our other excursions out on the channel soon.
Tip number 25 is about Endicott Arm in Dawes Glacier. This was on the morning of our Juneau port day from about 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. So the captain and the cruise director did a great job the night before, kind of communicating the timeline of when we'd actually be entering this part of the Inside Passage. And so that journey to Dawes Glacier actually started about 4 a.m. So we woke up a little before 5, I believe, just to take in as much of that scenery as possible. And if you're unfamiliar, Alaska and the Inside Passage, they have these things called arms, which is basically the body of water that leads up to a glacier that kind of is a tangent from the actual Inside Passage itself. So the water is extremely calm. It's this unique blue color. It's an absolutely incredible view. So we wanted to get up early, sit on our balcony, and really just take in the views for as much as we could. After we cruised the Endicott Arm, we arrived at Dawes Glacier by about 6 a.m. and were there for about an hour. We had a great amount of time to take photos and videos and really just take in the great scenery. Now, a note for a ship the size of Ovation of the Seas is you're actually stopped a good distance away from the glacier. On our morning, we were a few miles away, so you're not getting up right next to it, just due to the size of the ship and some of the icebergs that were in the water. So a great idea to have binoculars with you on your Endicott Arm morning so you could get an up-close view of the glacier if you are a few miles away.
And even to look out for wildlife. We were standing outside looking at the Dawes Glacier and someone said, "Oh my God, look, there are seals on that iceberg." And it was kind of hard to see with the naked eye, but pulled out the binoculars and it was just adorable.
Now, before you leave the Endicott Arm, the ship has to turn around to actually head out the way you came. So good idea to be in different parts of the ship if you want some different views of the glacier and the surrounding areas. One of the great parts of the ship that you could take in the views from is the solarium. We actually went to the solarium, and then right outside the solarium is the bridge wings, which are open air areas right above the bridge of the ship, where we got some great photos and videos. But a great feature of the Quantum class ships is they have a lot of indoor features, such as the solarium and then an indoor pool area, so that you can be inside and see the great scenery outside through windows when you're still in a climate controlled environment. And when we were not in the solarium, we did spend some time on our balcony. We booked a balcony on this cruise for this reason in particular, to really take in the scenery and the comfort of our cabin. Now, there is an excursion that actually leaves straight from Dawes Glacier itself. It's called the Endicott Arm Fjord and Glacier Explorer.
Tip number 26 is all about the port of Juneau, Alaska. Our ship, Ovation of the Seas, did dock right at the main port, but a lot of ships actually dock further down and have to take a complimentary shuttle to the main part of town where Ovation of the Seas docked.
It's the busiest port that we saw on our cruise. There was probably 5 or 6 other ships there while we were there, so on the busier side.
But there is a lot to do in the port of Juneau. There's Tracy's Crab Shack, which is really well known. There's a lot of different shops. They have the tram that goes up into the mountain. So there's definitely a lot to do here. We maybe had 30 to 45 minutes after our excursion before we had to be back on the ship. We went to a store called the Alaskan Shirt Company store?
So. Yeah.
I will say I've never been so overwhelmed in a store in my life. I actually gave Andy the things that we were buying and had to step out of there. It was so crowded. You could like barely walk in there, but they had a lot of different souvenirs and well priced, to be honest. So it's definitely one of the popular places to go. Like we said, with where the ships are docked, you may have 45 minutes after your excursion, but you have to factor in the time to take a shuttle to go where your ship is docked. So just something to keep in mind. But in Juneau, our excursion was called the Mendenhall Glacier Whale Watching and Wildlife Quest Tour. It was $465.98 for the two of us, and it was basically in two parts. The first half was a whale watching tour, which was a lot of fun. We got to see a lot of humpback whales. We saw bald eagles on the drive over. We saw sea lions, so lots of great Alaska wildlife. And then the second half was going over to the Mendenhall Glacier. We did hike over to Nugget Falls, which was about a mile walk each way, and then just spent some time taking photos of the glacier before heading back and exploring port for a little bit before getting back on the ship. But again, our full video of our day in Juneau will be out on the channel soon.
Last but not least, we have tip 27 for Victoria, British Columbia. We absolutely loved this city. Want to go back there either on another cruise or just in general. Really a lot of things to see. Great city on the water. We only had about 5 or 6 hours in this city, so since we loved it so much, we were a little sad we didn't have more time. The way the itinerary was set up is we were at sea for a portion of the morning and then got to Victoria middle of the day. And so our excursion really was in the afternoon and evening part of the day because it's really a pretty short cruise after that to get back to Seattle. So that's just how they structured the itinerary. So the excursion we did was called the Victoria BC Canadian Ale Trail and City Highlights Tours. What we were able to see was pretty much all in the name. We saw some highlights of the city. It was actually a guide that took us from the ship to some different spots within the city, and then to 3 different breweries. So the poutine that Jenna mentioned earlier in the video we had at the last stop, we thankfully had just the right amount of time to order some food there before we had to get back on the ship, but it was a really great experience. Victoria has a lot to offer culturally, so again, can't wait to go back.
And just something to keep in mind is that between the 3 breweries, we are walking. So definitely something to consider if you have mobility issues. And this excursion was $253.98 for the two of us.
In case you haven't caught on yet, a full video of this excursion will be out on the channel soon. So 27 tips for our Alaskan cruise. Hopefully that is enough to give you some information and context about the best way to plan and have your Alaska vacation. There's a lot more things we probably could have mentioned, but hopefully this again consolidates it in a video for you guys. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave us a comment. We would love to talk more about this vacation. We had an amazing time. And again, more videos from this vacation coming to the channel soon. But that is all we have for you today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on social media at A Couple Travelers.
And until next time, keep traveling.